After the initial revelation at Sinai in Parsha Yitro, Hashem calls Moshe up to tell him the content of the Brit that he would like to create with the Jewish people in the end of Mishpatim. As opposed to the Aseret HaDibrot, Hashem here is going to specify more of the details of what mitzvot he expects them to observe. Parshat Mishpatim consists of many, many different mitzvot that are part of this original covenant, this original Brit with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's interesting, though, is to see what the Parsha begins with. It begins with the laws of Avodim, Eved Ivri. All the things the Parsha could have begun with, this is what it chooses. Ibn Ezra explains that when a person is an Eved to someone else, in the control of someone else, there's no state lower than that. And that's why it's so important to make sure that that doesn't get out of control. And I think on the narrow level, when we talk about a person's own freedom, in the generation we live in where people are so free, but yet dictated to by their cell phones, by the news feeds, by social media, what they should think, what they should feel, it's a thought that we definitely need to consider. But what I want to focus on, in speaking about Avodim, is the halacha the Torah focused on at greatest detail, in greatest detail. And that is the ending of the Avdus. The first few psukim speak about how after 6 years, slave needs to be allowed out. Bigapo yavo, bigapo yetzeh. He leaves alone. He leaves without any responsibilities, without any shibudim. And after the Torah emphasizes the importance of him leaving, it finally speaks about the scenario where he stays. And that scenario is when he chooses to stay. When he says, "Ahavti et Adoni et eshti et b'nai lo eitzei chavshi." So, of course, as we know, he becomes an Eved. He continues until Yovel. It says here Leolam, but Chazal tells that's Yovel. But instead of just continuing, we know that there's a ceremony which consists of his whole being pierced up against the doorpost. It turns his ear and him into an Eved Nirtza. And obviously the question is, why is his ear pierced and a mum created? Torah doesn't mandate such things. You know, even when a person hurts someone else, we translate ayin tachat ayin as collecting money, not as taking out someone's eye. Why would we pierce their ear? Famously, Rashi explains that the ear that heard on Har Sinai, Hashem pronounced, enunciate, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. This ear chooses to want to be a slave, not just be forced to be a slave. The ear gets pierced. Rabbi Shimon continues this line of reasoning, and he explains that's why the doorpost is used. It was the doorpost that God had passed over in Egypt as part of the freedom for the Jewish people. And now he's choosing to remain a slave, so we pierce his ear up against the doorpost. I think there's an obvious question here, and that is, why is it only this Aveira that a person has his ear pierced for? Why not pierce his ear for all the Aveirot a person heard, commanded, and didn't follow? And if you'll say it's only the Aseret HaDibrot, why not pierce the ear of every person who doesn't show respect to their parents? Obviously, there's something uniquely significant about the choice of remaining a slave. I think we can get a better understanding of this by looking at the unique place of one's ear within relative to the other organs. The Gemara in Bava Kama Daf Pei Hey says that if you blind someone, you have to pay the decrease in their value. How much would they be sold as a slave with an eye? How much would they be sold for without the eye? The Gemara continues, if you cause someone to become deaf, you have to pay his whole value. The whole value is viewed as being lost. It seems from this Gemara in Bava Kama that the significance of being deaf is more than the significance of being blind. Yet we have another Gemara in Nedarim Daf Samach Daled, which talks about how there are 4 people who are considered like they're dead. Someone without children, someone who's an ani, someone who's a mitzora, and someone who's blind. It doesn't say someone who's deaf. So as far as damages, being deaf is more severe. But as far as life versus death, being blind is more severe. Why is that? I think the explanation cuts to the very heart of the significance of who we are, how we function, the different roles that each organ plays. A person who can't see is not alive because they can't see anything in their existence. They can't evaluate anything they're seeing. They can't see it. They're totally dependent on the information given to them by other people. And that's why a person who can't see is considered dead. On the other hand, a person who can't hear cannot function at all as an Eved because they can't take instructions. They can see and make choices for themselves, but they're not an Eved at all. A person who loses an eye can be an Eved because he can hear the commandments of his master, and that's why he still has some value as an Eved. But a person who's lost the ability to hear can't be an Eved at all. And I think this returns back to the significance of Ki li bnei Yisrael avodim, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, as opposed to a person choosing to be a slave. A person who chooses to be a slave is a person who is committing themselves to some other master besides God. A person who lacks an appreciation for what it means to be an Eved Hashem. Such a person needs a correction on his ear because he's not heeding God's commandments, he's heeding the commandments of a human master. The eyes are very important because they give us the ability to decide. But the ears are important because they give us the ability to be an Eved L'Hashem. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah Daf Chof says that the Malach HaMoves is a being full of eyes. I think we can connect this to the Gemara in Sota Daf Ches, which says, Ein Yetzer Hara Sholeit Ele B'ma She'ein Avros. The Yetzer Hara only dominates, only controls what we see. And we know this. If a person is told about a possibility to sin, it's never going to be as alluring, as exciting as something a person sees. The eyes are what cause us to drift, to go astray. It's about the balance between the freedom to see and desire versus the commitment to listen and follow. Anochi Hashem Elokecha is something we all heard, something we all need to internalize and remember to commit ourselves to, even at times when we see other options that appeal to us. Let's make sure to continue heeding by hearing properly the right things we need to remember from Har Sinai and use them to follow Ve'el HaMishpatim. Shabbat Shalom.